No, I like this one. Okay. I'm ready. You ready? Yeah. Sorry, just a little technical problem. So, Francesco Verso, who? Yes, right. You probably hear something yesterday for the one that were at the ceremony. So again, thank you for this award. I'm very, very thankful and really appreciate your kindness of having me here to talk about this subject that is going to be preserving the biodiversity of the future through this small project that I've developed in the last years. I've dedicated the last 12, 13 years of my life to science fiction. First as a writer, then as an editor, lately also as a small publisher, and sometimes as a tentative translator. As a writer, I've won a couple of major Italian science fiction awards. I won twice the Italian award as best science fiction novel and editor, and I've created this label, this future fiction project that I will tell you about. I don't know if you are aware of the history of science fiction in general terms, but I would like to show you just this beautiful map that is an infographic developed by Ward Shelley. You can go and watch it at www.wardshelley.com. In this one single picture, you have the whole history of Western science fiction. That is important to say, because I'm working now with the Chinese people to develop the Eastern history of science fiction. I will go briefly into this because it is important for what I will say afterwards. Science fiction is a kind of literature that has roots into two main important psychological feelings. That is fear and wonder. Before science fiction there was the fantastic, there was the use of imagination. The limit of our human knowledge was in a way explained by supernatural forces, by the divine, by spiritual, or something that we cannot really understand, something that sometimes, many times, will be called God or gods. Up to a certain time, this happened until man started to use reason and logic and apply that to fiction as well. Before that, think about the big epics and the legends, Homer, the Iliad. Think about Gilgamesh. This is also the quest for immortality, the quest for other worlds. But the explanation was not scientific, it was irrational. It was taking a force that could not be explained and trying to reduce that to human terms. Okay? Then, when the Enlightenment arrived in France, something changed. Some authors start to apply the scientific method, or what it was called the rationality, to fiction. And what is called, for example, the first science fiction book, which is written, by the way, by a woman, is the Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, because she tries to apply the first experiments that Galvani, the Italian scientist, was doing on the frogs on electricity, trying to revive a corpse. Of course, I would like also to... This book, Frankenstein, in very brief elements, started what we called afterwards the hard science fiction. But there's another kind of science fiction I would like to point out that is sociological and political science fiction that starts also in this period of time with another very important book that is considered a children's book, but which is not, which is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Through the use of metaphor and allegories, Jonathan Swift, using the Lilliputians, using the talking horses, using the floating island of Laputa, wants to criticize the England and the people, the different kind of people in England at his time. This is the first time that we see that. Of course, we've been talking before about other kind of utopian by Tommaso Campanella, but really the books start to use this as a way to masquerade, to change something that is not real and put it into fictional terms. I will go very fast here because this is, of course, a long ride, probably 150 years long. But of course I have to mention the beginning of science fiction, what we consider in the West, the beginning of science fiction. It's US, America, the early pulp magazines. The important figure in this moment, of course, is the use of science fiction to popularize many technologies, many innovation at that time. Science fiction was published on these pulp magazines because they were very rough, very cheap paper, and astounding science fiction, amazing stories were also used for helping people how to, for example, build an engine, fix some kind of problems you might have with pipes, how to build, I don't know, repair many objects. And in these papers, they were slipping in science fiction stories. That's how they arrived to the people. But it was a mass phenomenon because they started to distribute these papers, these very cheap paperbacks, to subways and train stations. So a lot of people was reading at the time. This is the early age of science fiction. This is really what is considered the golden age. In a way, from my personal opinion and from my personal point of view, this is not really a breakthrough in the science fiction genre because it's a kind of reusing the trope of the geographic exploration. So you take a ship and you change it into a starship. You take native people and you turn it into an alien. You take a gun and you turn it into a laser gun. There's nothing much difference if you read these kind of stories with the adventure stories of Emilio Salgari, for example, or Jules Verne at the beginning, right? So the geography becomes the space. So at the beginning, science fiction is, the main drive is the outer space. We go and conquer other worlds as we did with other continents. But it's not just like that. Of course, there's been a lot of many different kinds of science fiction. As I said, the sociological and anthropological and political science fiction were also always there. If you think of Robert Sheckley, if you think of Corwin and Smith, because these two souls, these two elements of science fiction are always being side by side. One is entertaining science fiction, adventure science fiction. The other is analytic, trying to criticize the system, trying to look. It's like a sort of balance between one is pushing, the other is trying to say, okay, are you sure that that's the right direction? And indeed, that was exactly what happened. Because with the crisis, as I said before, of capitalism and the war in Vietnam, a lot of science fiction writers turned from the outer space to the inner space. That means, for example, that authors like Philip K. Dick, J.G. Ballard, they say the alien is not outside, the alien is not in another galaxy, the alien is inside of us. We are alienated. We are the aliens. Reality is not what the media tell us. Reality is probably something more obscure, something we cannot even grasp, something that they don't want us to really understand. And you have all the books of Philip K. Dick coming out with this kind of hallucination. think that that is the time of the sex revolution, that is the time of cultural revolution, that is the time of drugs, of big concerts. So this all creates this atmosphere, this bizarre idea that reality is really not what it looks like. The big breakthrough in this period, at the beginning of the 80s, is 1984. I think it was 1984. The time of the publishing of Neuromancer by William Gibson. I didn't mention the two big dystopias of the early 30s and 40s, of course, Brave New World and 1984. But in that book, really, we perceive the present. At that time, it was something extraordinary, something that really changed the rules of the game, because William Gibson understood the importance of information technology. He understood the development of late capitalism. He understood the shift in the hero model. We were used to a kind of male, very affirmative, very strong character that could rule the others, that could set the ruling conditions. William Gibson turned that upside down. The paradigm of cyberpunk is low-life, high-tech. The low-life typically is a nerd, a geek, an outcast, somebody that is out of the system, tries to fight the system, and many times he loses, but sometimes when he wins for himself. Okay? This changed completely. If you think of The Matrix, if you think of all the movies that came with this cyberpunk label, the thing we use, the zippers, the hoods, the mirror shades, we are into a cyberpunk novel right now. And I can tell you that because I've been to China, and it's exactly a cyberpunk setting. They are living their cyberpunk at the moment. So, at that time, and maybe even some years later, they said science fiction is dead. Come on, science fiction is just what we live now. What can be next? I will tell you what can be next. But before that, I have to take you, again, 5 minutes, but this is very important. I will take you here because I want to explain. This is my personal finding, in a way. I use this to show, to demonstrate what for me is science fiction different from fantastic and fantasy, okay? Think of technology, but doesn't have to be technology like something that has to do with precise disciplines. It could be any novum, to say in the way of Darko Suvin, any novum that creates a cognitive estrangement. For cognitive estrangement, I mean something that looks familiar, but it really creates something new, weird. And I will tell you, I will make you an example. But first of all, any technology, before it's used, it must be imagined by a writer, a scientist, by any person. So any technology is first envisioned, like for example, the quantum computing, the gene therapy, the DNA test. Somebody comes with this idea. Then at the second step, it becomes operational. It's an early prototype, like the lab-grown meat, like the space shuttle when it was created. Then technology goes out of the lab and gets into a factory, and it becomes applied in the society. It becomes accessible and affordable, like breast implants, like chemotherapy. Out of the factory, technology gets into the houses. It's accepted like part of our life. The light bulbs, the solar cells, psychotherapy. At the highest level of this pyramid of technology, we have technologies that are vital. They are on our bodies. They start to go out of the house and get into the tissue of our anatomy. Like, for example, the internet, the glasses, sewage. At the highest level, technology becomes invisible becomes something we don't are. We cannot find out the division between us and technology, like money, computers, antibiotics. At the highest level, technology becomes a second nature. It becomes something we cannot live without, something that is not distinguishable from nature. Like agriculture, the clock, or writing, which is a very ancient technology.
Right, so I like to think of, say, bureaucracy as an invention, if not a technology. So where would you place it in your scale?
It's very high here, because
6 or 7.
Because we feel it. We feel like a natural burden, something.
How society can exist?
It's like I think bureaucracy is like is the byproduct of any organization. If you take waste as a byproduct of an industry, bureaucracy is the waste of organization. Well,
it's a means of organization as well.
Sorry?
It's a means of organization as well.
It's a means of, but bureaucracy is the bad part of this organization. It's the inefficient part in a way, right? When it gets like that. Okay, this is now getting important because this is the engine of science fiction for me, and I will show you what's the effect of science fiction when we read it, when we feel it, when we see it. So this was the vertical axis that I showed you. Now I will show you what happens when we introduce time. Okay? Time. Any technology has a rise and development and a fall and decay. Okay? Every technology becomes old. It becomes obsolete. Okay? What happens? That in this part, the technology, when, for example, there is the lab-grown meat, the nuclear energy, the email, the sewage, the quantum computer, okay? Think about it like this, okay? In this part of the technology, there is the fax machine. How many of you use the fax machine? Yeah? 1, 2, 3, okay. How many of you use the postal service? You know? How many of you use the steam engine? Steam engine? Steam engine is what? Steam engine is dead, okay? This is very important to keep in mind. So I want to show you this because it's important to understand the development of technologies. In this part I show you, this is still where fear meets wonder. Remember the two feelings, fear and wonder. In this part of the technology, science fiction creates this drama, this dilemma, that in this other part, it cannot create it anymore, and I will tell you why. If I go into a room and I turn on the light, what's the effect? Nothing. Electricity is something of mainstream, right? It doesn't create any wow, okay? But if I ask you, how many of you would eat a 3D printed hamburger? Okay, 4, 5. How many would not eat an hamburger 3D printed? Okay? 5, 6. You split in two. You have, towards this new technology that is there, an ambiguous reaction. Some are fearful, some are curious and want to go there. So, this is exactly what, when you read science fiction, you have exactly this effect. And that is why. Because the drama, the moral drama, should I do it, should I not do it, is the uncanny valley, and I'll explain the uncanny valley, on the tech pyramid. Let's say we are there. Because if we're here, and I will tell you, think about steampunk. How many of you read steampunk? Steampunk? Okay. Steampunk could be something very nice, could be very good fiction, very good stories, good character, good plot, and everything. But the technologies inside the steampunk cannot create any drama in you, because the steam engine is here, because the age of the aesthetics of the Victorian age, we know it. It can be good, but it's a nostalgic effect. It is not a breakthrough effect. The steam engine, electricity, the horse and carriage, or however, even you know, all these technologies, they cannot make you go, wow, oh, this is something new, this is something, you all know it. So, steampunk is a backward kind of science fiction, is a retro science fiction, using nostalgia to create this effect. But from my personal opinion, my point of view, it's like shooting with an empty gun. You're shooting, but you have no bullet, because the bullet is there. The bullet is where you are able to create this effect, the effect of the uncanny valley. Uncanny valley means mysterious part. So you have to create and find this technology or this innovation, this novel, and I will tell you how it works, that creates this moral drama. The uncanny valley is this curve that we feel when something is different from us. The industrial robot doesn't create a threat to our identity. The workers are happy to work with a robotic hand. But when this hand becomes an artificial intelligence and a robot that can substitute them, then we're scared, because it's a threat to our identity. And the worst case is the zombie. We don't want to be close to the zombie. The zombie is just like us. It's just a human person, but in a different biological state. Is putrefying, is dying. We take a distance from that, okay? But then something strange happens, because as technology becomes more and more like us, we like it so much and we don't feel the difference between us and our alter. So if you've seen Westworld, have you seen Westworld or Blade Runner? The Nexus 6? The guests in Westworld, they're just like us. We want to be like them. We feel that they are better than us, in a way. So, we are here. We like that. Okay? Alright, but first, I'll go back. The example I wanted to tell you. Think about a book written in 1920, when the writer introduced this very incredible piece of technology, a magic pill that can interrupt the pregnancy, and the woman can choose not to have a baby without big consequences. Think about this magic pill in 1910, 1920. Isn't it science fiction? Doesn't it create drama for the woman? Doesn't it create consequences, unexpected consequences that really can affect thousands of people? Put this technology today.
Are you for it, sir?
Huh?
Are you for it, sir?
Yes. Put this technology, this pill, in the year 2020, or 19, or now. Does it create any kind of sense of wonder, any fear? It's the lack of that that creates fear today. Okay? This is just to show how a piece of technology is science fiction in one moment and it's mainstream in another moment. So my definition of science fiction, something that took me 10 years to develop, is very brief, very short. For me, science fiction is what makes reality obsolete. And for obsolete, I mean anything that could be a new rule, a new technology, a new innovation, whether it's political, biological, artificial. It has to make reality obsolete. From that point on, the things change. Nothing is like before. So we'll go into that because I wanted to tell you about this kind of science fiction that is important for me, because this is not dead. Science fiction is still alive. It will always be alive for a very simple reason, because it has to deal with transformation and innovation. So to the people that say science fiction is dead, I just say, but you just have to push the boundary a little bit farther. But as long as innovation and transformation will be there, you will have science fiction. It's just that kind of science fiction that was far away is getting very close, so you don't feel that wow effect anymore. You have to look at other things. But for the people that were yesterday at the Word, I already mentioned the 3% problem, because now I will go into the biodiversity of the future. This is also the really important matter. So I will not go much into that. I just told you that 3% of what is published in the US comes from English-speaking countries. Oh no. It goes. Okay, this is the map. So far we have published people and stories coming from. No. Is there a way to stop? Oh, okay. Okay, I have to do it like that. Okay, thank you. Okay, so no, doesn't like it. Actually, it does go.
Science fiction.
No, it's not science fiction.
It's okay.
Okay, I hope it stops. Well, I have to. But I don't see nothing. So anyway, this is just a map to show that we've been publishing stories from 8 languages and more than 20 countries at the moment with this project, Future Fiction, that was born exactly for this reason, because I was looking for stories and I find always the same kind of story, written by the same kind of author, a white American man, probably coming from a middle class environment and capitalistic mindset and a Christian religion. So I went looking for the rest of the world and I found really wonderful things. And now, so what kind of future do we represent on science fiction? If you have a scale of stories that range from optimism to pessimism, this is a fiction, the range of stories. For example, at the top of optimism in fantasy, and here you have also impossible stories, possible stories, plausible stories, probable stories, plausible pessimistic stories, possible pessimistic stories, and impossible pessimistic stories, okay? Just to show you the range, because this is small, okay? But here you have the Lord of the Rings, for example. You know, Sauron at the end, and the ring is destroyed. So it's a good story that happens, that ends very well. Then you have utopian stories, for example, like The Foundation by Isaac Asimov. Is it still possible? Well, in a very long time, could be. Then you have, for example, The River of Gods by Ian MacDonald. I don't know if you read it. It's a kind of plausible stories. Neuromancer, The Diamond Age, The Clockwork Orange. You see, we're going slightly from optimism to pessimism. The masterpiece of Anthony Burgess. He imagines a world where violence is erased by the state, justified by the fact that our nature is a bad nature. So is the state in charge of that? Is the state, can the state be allowed to impose a kind of behavior on the humans? Is it science fiction? I think it's really science fiction. The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard, The Road by Cormac McCarthy. So just to say that we try to scout and look for the stories that are highly probable, that have a very high degree of plausibility. Something that might happen in 10, 20 years of time. And when we find the stories, we try to preserve the biodiversity of the culture by keeping the original language, or at least trying to have it in dual language, okay? So these, for example, are dual language book, and I brought with me a selection of stories that are being published in Italian and in the original language. So we have Vandana Singh, for example, from India. She writes in English and is in dual language. Rich Larson from Niger, is African, very good writer that writes about the future of Africa, the future stories set in the continent, but have a very important relevance also for posthumanism, artificial intelligence, biopolitics, social engineering, stuff like that. Sarah Castle, she's from the US and is a biologist, but also a science fiction writer, and she talks about climate change. Climate change, as strange as it might sound, but is a part of science fiction, because climate change has to do with building scenarios, planning possible futures, trying to avoid a catastrophe. So we've been seeing this dystopia and post-apocalyptic scenarios over and over again, but it's time that we move on from just telling this story to finding some kind of solution, some kind of approach. So science fiction is doing that also in the climate change section, let's say. James Patrick Kelly, and then of course Nebula and Sinosfera, that are the first two ever published anthologies of contemporary Chinese science fiction in Italian and Chinese language. And we will do Medusa by Caterina Bacillo, a Russian author, very good one, with the Russian text and the Italian text. It's out next month for the Worldcon in Dublin. What is it? Okay. And then other stories from Italy, La Consistenza delle Idee by Claire Faris, Carlos Hernandez from Cuba, Claude Lalmière from Canada, S.B. Divya from India, Ladi Tidar from Israel, Chen Chufat from China. This is a collection of German stories, German science fiction. And then again, Yekaterina Selya from Russia. Okay. Then I'll go briefly to... Okay. I'll go briefly into China's Dream. I've been looking at the new things that were coming out in the science fiction genre. I've found Ken Liu. Ken Liu is probably the best short stories writer at the moment, I think, in the world. And he happens to be a man of two worlds. He was raised in China, and at 7-8 years he went to the US. And through Ken Liu, I was able to read a lot of Chinese science fiction in translation, in English translation. He's the gateway of Chinese literature into the English world. And I've got to know a lot of them. I've been in China 3 the Chinese writers to Italy. We have now many projects in place, many anthologies. China at the moment is a huge social technological science fiction project for me. I'm seeing things that humans, like, you know, what's the name? Rutger Hauer was saying. This is not a panda, this is a solar panel installation. China at the moment is the biggest polluter of the world, but it's also the biggest investor in renewable resources. So they're living this, you know, schizophrenic present time where they are the best and the worst in many things. High-tech China, you probably heard about this trade and tariff war going on at the moment for the 5G. Is a big thing. High-tech China is just the tip of the iceberg about what will happen and about the technologies that will allow us to do things that we still don't know, or on the other side, being controlled, surveillance. All these things are very, very relevant to the present time. And of course, I've seen that huge bridge coming from Podgorica to BIELO, and instead of looking at the bridge, I was looking at the camp, and the camp, all the writings were in Chinese. So I thought, who's building the bridge? The Chinese are building that bridge. So they're, you know, these big investors, or anyway, big projects, they can do them. And one of them was, of course, the One Road, One Belt initiative, a kind of Silk Road 2.0 that will connect Xi'an to Asia, and then arriving from probably Turkey, and then to Europe and the west of Europe. So what I've tried to capture in these stories is this element of transformation, of innovation that they are living. They have a very old, ancient society, but it's projected into the future at a very, very high speed. We're not talking about speed anymore, we're talking about acceleration, which creates another dimension. We have gone in the 19th century from riding a horse to driving a car, to flying an airplane, to go on space, on the space shuttle. In this century, we are accelerating. And we don't know the pace where it will lead us, but we just know that we are looking at artificial intelligence, blockchain, Bitcoin, all these big things, cloud computing, quantum computing. This is happening not just in the US, it's happening also in China. They have the highest number of engineers every year. They have the new Silicon Valley is in Shenzhen at the moment, a city that was able to grow from 30,000 people 20 years ago to 60 million people now. So this creates, you know, the size doesn't matter, because if you have 2 dots or 3 dots, it's one thing of a network. But if you have 10,000 dots or 10 million dots, things are really changing. Contemporary Chinese science fiction, I have to mention, of course, Xie Zha and Chen Qufang. They are the rising stars, young generation of authors, a generation called Balin Ho, people that were born after the 80s and 90s. They mix. Xie Zha mixes human feelings, the Chinese tradition, the legends, the mythology, with the latest technology, how these technologies affect the psychology, the human relation, the family affairs, how artificial intelligence, algorithm, the use of smartphones, the use of social networks, how do they impact the perception of our identity, the perception of our family. Is our family just the people around us, or through the use of technology we can extend the concept of family to other members that would not be there, for example? The other side of this approach is Chen Fan. He looks at the way capitalism and industry and technology creates an alienation and kind of new slaves, tech slaves. It's really interesting to read these short stories. I think it's really worth to read. Okay, I would like, I don't know how much time. 5-10 minutes? Okay, I would like to. Couple of two things I mentioned briefly yesterday with Anna. It was just again 5 minutes, so I have to go again. I'm sorry, but two trends: post-colonial science fiction. Again, of course, as I said, the idea of diversity, the idea of something new from the usual names, the usual themes, the usual point of view is becoming more and more relevant. And especially the countries that are now free from the colonial and the imperialistic dominance are now able to use their countries, their culture, their language as their setting. So big countries like China, India, Nigeria, Brazil, and important cultures like China, Latin America, Europe, they are rising. The limit, of course, and the problem is always the translation, but we see more and more of this. Another important trend that I would like to mention is solar punk. As I said before, cyberpunk is dead because it's now in our reality. But what could be new? There are many things that could be used in a new way. For example, the paradigm of cyberpunk, that is low-life, high-tech, could be transformed into new-life, sustainable technologies. So, the innovations that are being promoted or talked about in the cyberpunk are typically computers, personal computers, networks, and corporations. But now we could use 3D printing, cloud computing or mesh networking, and the corporations, the state that has become a nation, state has become an industry. Think about the relationship between this president of the United States and the things he say to the companies. No, you cannot make trade with China. He said not to the Chinese president. He said it to the owner of the CIO of the company. What was Huawei, right? So the state talks to the corporation. So is it really a free market? I have some doubts. Another thing is the setting. In cyberpunk, the setting, as I said, is the individual, is the person, one single person, the nerd, the geek. It's always set in urban setting, in a city, the sprawl of cyberpunk, the never-ending city, the colorization. You never see nature in a cyberpunk novel. Pollution, of course, is always dark, it's always gray, it's always very polluted. And info technology. In solarpunk, the accent is on the community of people. We are not alone anymore. If you want to fight back, we have to get together. Think about big projects of cooperation, of mass cooperation, like Wikipedia, for example. Something that would never happen 20 years ago. Now, this mass cooperation has created the biggest and most important encyclopedia of the human time. Outdoor. Instead of always being in a room, in a city, on a tram, in a car, you could be outside. You could walk. And my latest book is called The Walkers. And I use all this thing to create a kind of novel that changes the usual cyberpunk and creates a kind of solarpunk approach with the use of nanotechnology, with the use of 3D printing, with the use of artificial photosynthesis to create energy directly from our skin. So of course, this I'm talking about science fiction, so allows some imagination. But I can tell you that already the first artificial leaves have been created. So artificial photosynthesis is already in the labs. So if you remember the tech pyramid, out of the lab, it will go in the houses someday, very soon. Don't forget that somebody said that PCs would never enter in any house. And I was in a company that said exactly like that. What? Personal computers? No, come on, forget it. The last thing, if I can manage it. Okay, we will go spreading this word in many places. We've been to Turin Book Fair in May, and now REFESTIKON in Montenegro. We'll go to Dublin for the WorldCon. We go to Belfast for the Eurocon. We'll go to Internet Festival in Pisa in October, Strani Mondi in Milan. We'll go to Book Pride in Genoa. We'll go to China in November, together, I hope, with Ian MacDonald and James Patrick Kelly. We'll go to Pisa Book Festival again in November, and then Roma Book Fair, and then again we will go to Shenzhen in December for a huge Biennale. It's a world exhibit on smart cities, on the relationship between architecture, science fiction, and the way we will live in the future cities. So that's all. Thank you very much.